second theory that we're going to look at of attachment, and I'm going to start by just getting you to think about the theory of evolution, a theory that I don't think you will have looked at yet in psychology, but it's a theory that will be very useful for you to use, particularly in year two, particularly when you're doing issues and debates to try to explain some of those concepts. So the person we're going to be looking at is a guy called Bowlby. And according to Bowlby, attachment is a behaviour that has evolved, so it's changed and developed because of its survival value. Can you just have a think for a minute about how you think attachment might help infants to survive? And some of these images might help you with that. So just for a minute, think about whether we're talking about animals or humans, but what is it about an attachment that aids survival? So I will be covering some of this in the lesson on Thursday, but I just want you to think for a minute about what that might be. So the objectives for this lesson are to explore the evolutionary theory of attachment, and it's often called Bowlby's theory of attachment, and I'll make it clear that sometimes it can be worded in a slightly different way. So when I see you in person, I'll talk about how it could be worded by AQA and what sort of things you need to look for to choose the right theory. So this is where we're up to, and if we just have a look on the specification, explanations of attachment, in the red we've just looked at learning theory. So here, as you can see, apologies, let me go back, in this case it's called Bowlby's monotropic theory, but when you actually look in a lot of the textbooks it's referred to as an evolutionary theory, often it's just referred to as Bowlby's theory of attachment. And again, we've got some key things here that you need to look at, and there are two that are named, a critical period and an internal working model. So again, they're named on the spec, so you could be asked about those two. Similarly, you could be asked about this word monotropic because it is on the specification. So that's what we're going to go through in this session. And largely this session, I'm going to be introducing a lot of the concepts, assuming that you don't have any previous knowledge of evolutionary theory. So there are obviously lots of theories and explanations about why and how we form an attachment. So we've looked at one of the major approaches, which is this kind of external view of learning an attachment, but now we're going to look at a more internal view, which is an evolutionary theory. And this is probably, even though it's worded as evolutionary theory, monotropic theory, it's actually the one that you probably will understand the most, because it's what I think we're brought up to kind of believe and expect that this is actually what the role of our caregivers is. So an evolutionary trait is always genetically transmitted. So children are born with a drive to become attached to a caregiver. So what I mean by a drive is, it's like a kind of force. So it's something that's going to happen. And if you're okay with the word innate, and that's a term there that you need to know, innate means kind of inbuilt, it's biological. So if you like, we don't really have a say over it. So what we're saying is that there's something within us, within our genes and DNA, that means that we have I'll use the word template, or like a blueprint, to want to attach to someone. So even if nobody came near us, we would want to feel that we needed to be around someone. So that's what this is really saying. And Bowlby was influenced by the research of Lorenz. Now, what I don't want you to say is that Lorenz's research led Bowlby to do this, because he didn't. It was just that he was quite interested by what the Goslings were doing. And he was interested in the idea of imprinting. And if you think about imprinting, it's the idea that something is already imprinted, if you like, on the brain, and therefore you don't have a say over it. So that's what we're kind of saying, and it's the idea that those Goslings would attach to whatever they saw first, whether it was a Wellington boot or a rubber glove, it didn't matter. So Bowlby's drawing on the idea of that. So there's Lorenz, just to remind you. And those Goslings clearly had a blueprint to want to attach, regardless of whether the person fed them. It was the thing, the moving object, that they saw first. So some of the principles of evolutionary theory, and I will go through these, I have put in bold and in capitals what I would call key terminology. So when you're looking at that top band and it says must use terminology, this is an example of what we mean by has the candidate used terminology. So when you're talking about evolutionary theory, you're going to see the word useful a lot, and what it means is use. It literally means um, something that is helpful in some way. So evolution is the process whereby useful characteristics are introduced into a species. So if you think about everything that you have on your body, it should have a use, or we don't need it. So something that we don't need, like a tail, would have been evolved out and was evolved out years ago. There are some people who still have remnants of a tail, but essentially that has been naturally selected out. So characteristics are useful if they help survival. So another key word there is survival. And why do we want to survive? Because we want to reproduce. So key terms for evolutionary theory, everything is about survival and reproduction. Because if you don't survive, you can't reproduce, and therefore your species ends, if you like. So to survive and reproduce, animals need to be well adapted to their environment. Now, the word adaptation generally means useful. So what that sentence actually means is that features, characteristics that animals have must be useful to help them around and navigate around their environment. And therefore, useful features are said to be adaptive. So anything that you might find helpful, useful, and again, when I see you, we'll talk about this, just have a little bit of a think about what kind of things might be useful. So if you're thinking about something like a tiger which has whiskers, why would it need whiskers? What is useful about having those? Similarly, claws, what is useful about having them? And why does a mole not need to have eyes, which are they're now fused together, so it doesn't need to see? Why not? So you can see that over time, features of each species are selected in and out in order to allow them to navigate around their environment. So a giraffe has a tall neck. Why? Because it needs to eat from the top of trees, because it's the best way that it will survive. If it bends down to eat, it's going to be at risk of predators. So again, it needs the long neck. So this is just a bit of background. Now, caregiving is also an evolutionary behaviour. And this now that I'm going to go through is quite a tricky concept to get your head round, because it's something that when I first looked at this, I didn't believe or accept was the case at all. So it is quite weird, this, and I expect you to ask me some questions on this. So infants are born with certain characteristics which elicit caregiving. So that word elicit, it's a word that's used a lot by AQA, but what does it mean? So it means which lead to caregiving, which result in, if you like, but not just that. It's that they almost, when they elicit, it's kind of like, it's a bit more like a sort of drive that, it's quite a strong drive. And these are called social releases. So I want you to just look at these babies now, and I know that you might feel quite judgmental looking at these, but have a look at the pictures of these babies and think about which ones are most likely to attract caregiving and why. Now you'll have to take your politically correct hat off for a minute and just think about which ones. And I'm not going to talk about too much about the individual pictures, but I want you to think about what it is that we see as being cute in these babies. And I'm sure you would agree that what we've got here that's cute are eyes, large eyes. We've got large eyes here. Why is that cute? Again, we've got a smile here from this baby, and here we've got some kind of smile and sort of interaction. So who are the most likely to attract caregiving? Possibly these, maybe this one, because they look cute. These are called social releases. So they are features of a baby that make us want to care for them. Now that sounds weird, because you might think, well, no, we don't have eyes so that you can care for us. No, but the idea of the eyes being big is quite cute. And if you think about it in terms of puppies and kittens, they also have features that elicit caregiving. So we want to care for them because they look cute. And again, it could be physical features like this, or it could be cute things they do. So it could be smiling, gurgling, so on. And I will talk about that in more depth when I see you. But that's just, first of all, there's a reason for that, and you'll see when we go through the theory. So here's Bowlby. And this is one of his most famous quotes. It's not a quote that you have to know, but if you look at this quote basically tells you how important he believes an attachment is. And that's really what you need to take from this. Not so much the quote and learning it, but the idea that he's almost saying, you can, when you know this quote, you'll understand why his theory goes down the route that it does. So he's saying that he's saying it's vital, that it's absolutely essential to have an attachment. Okay, so I've used these for a few years now. If you want to add them into your booklet, you can do, but it's just a way of remembering something. So some kind of mnemonic to help you to remember these stages or these parts of the theory. So it's broken down into a couple of parts. And what I would want you to do is have a look on page 14 in your textbook for evolutionary theory, if you've got that, and find out what each of these letters stand for and make notes about each key term. So what do they actually mean? And you should find that A stands for adaptive. So if you don't have a textbook available to look at this, go and have a look at what is meant by adaptive in terms of Bowlby's theory. S, social releases. I've just talked about that. They are things that elicit and make you want to care for someone. C, critical period. Again, I'll talk about what that is in a minute. M, monotropy or monotropy, depending on how you pronounce it. And finally, I, internal working model. So if we're in class now, I would get you to spend a few minutes just having a look at what they were, ready to feed back. So now we're going to go through those. And here is Bowlby's theory, the main part of it, and this is his monotropic theory. First of all, he says, number one, attachments are adaptive. What does that mean? It means they're useful. We have an attachment because it makes us more likely to survive. If we don't have one, we won't survive. Therefore, they are adaptive. If you look at any species that is abandoned at birth, if we think about chicks abandoned in a nest for whatever reason, they will die, essentially, unless another caregiver takes over. So why is that? Because of safety, food and warmth. So the first part of Bowlby's theory is attachments are adaptive or useful. Again, if you're not happy with the terminology, they make us more likely to survive. Babies have social releases. Right, so social releases are features that unlock an innate tendency of adults to want to care for them. So we've got some social releases here with the eyes, we've got the cute smile and so on. So the social releases could be something like physical, so typical baby face features. And if you think about particularly a female and what she does to make herself look attractive, she emphasizes her eyes and her smile. She wouldn't emphasize features like a nose because they don't elicit caregiving. So you want to emphasize features because it's like an inbuilt thing in humans that we respond to certain features. And the evolutionary theory suggests that we respond more favourably to baby face features and body proportions. I'm not saying that all the way through relationships, by the way, I'll talk to you about that in class. It could also be behavioural, so crying, cooing, smiling. I mean, when a baby smiles at you, it really does make you want to go over and interact with the child, and that's a social releaser. Okay. So, babies have to form an attachment with their caregiver during a critical period. Now, sometimes this is referred to as a sensitive period. It's named on the spec as a critical period, but if you see it in a textbook as a sensitive period, it is the same thing. Just make sure you're aware, and you need to know what that is. So the first thing that you really need to take from this, and this is something that you can't get away from knowing and you've got to get accurately, is that this happens between birth and 2.5 years old. And this next bit is the thing that makes Bowlby, in my opinion, very controversial. Because Bowlby said if this didn't happen, the child would be damaged for life. And he goes on further to say, not just in one way, but socially, so they won't be able to form proper relationships, so they'll do it in a maladaptive way. Emotionally, so they might be quite aggressive or have very emotional outbursts or struggle to control their cry or whatever. Intellectually, so they might be more developmentally delayed, and physically, they might not grow as tall, as strong, and so on. And you'll see some examples throughout this unit of that. So if I can just now flick back to this, now you can understand Bowlby's quote, because he says that mother love in infancy has got to happen in the first 2.5 years. So the tip from here is, if you come across a STEM where a child is adopted after 2.5 years, are there going to be any problems? Yes, definitely. If a child is adopted or fostered before 2.5 years, that's okay. So that's what I mean. That's a critical period that you need to think about, and that's something that you need to take from this. So obviously we're going to look at, over the next few lessons, what those effects might be. So Bowlby believed that infants form one very special attachment, and originally in 1958, when he came out with this theory, he said that would be the mum. But he's had to amend that over the years, and he's now conceded that is a caregiver. It doesn't have to be the mum. And this special intense attachment is called monotropy. It's on the specification. You need to know what this means. So mono, if you think about like a monorail, it's one rail going round. So mono, one attachment. If the mother isn't available, it could be somebody else. But the point is, it is a monotropous relationship. It is with one person only. And think about, if we go back to Schaefer and Emerson's stages, the stage where you form one attachment, and that fits in with Bowlby's theory. And finally, through this monotropic attachment, the infant forms an internal working model. And the best way to describe that is, it is like a template. And if you think that the first relationship that you ever have in your life is with your mum, your dad, your caregiver, whoever it is, that forms a mental kind of framework in your head, a template that you will then use to base all future relationships on. And remember, the theory is innate, so you can't do anything about this. Now we've got this idea of determinism coming in, this idea that we don't actually have any free will or say over our internal working model. So we can try our best to change this, but you could argue that fundamentally it's a template that we can't do anything about. And the idea is that all future relationships will now be based on this. So Bowlby was very, very critical of mothering styles and so on, because he said that would potentially affect your child's future. So if you just look at the images, first of all, affect the future with the friendships that they're going to make, and then affect the romantic relationships. So that's what is meant by the internal working model. And the reason it's called internal is because it's just some kind of mechanism within us, and we don't have the ability to change it. So, to summarise, this is the main summary of evolutionary theory, AO1, knowledge and understanding. Number 1, attachments form with those who respond to a child's signals. If nobody responds, eventually the attachment isn't going to form. You will try and try and try, but it won't. Attachment will correlate. I hope we're okay with that word. So as one thing increases, the other one will, or so on. Attachment will correlate with other aspects of biological development. So a strong attachment will lead to strong biological development. Again, I'll talk about that when we look at some studies of orphans in different countries. There'll be a special attachment figure that is more important than others. Look for that person and look if there's a case study or whatever, and that will be the monotropic attachment. And the other thing that Bowlby says, which is probably the most dramatic thing, and we'll further look at this, and we'll bring this up when we look at forensic, because we're going to have a look at these early attachments and the link with psychopaths in later life. So this disruption of attachments will have developmental consequences, and one of those consequences, Bowlby says, is criminality. So he says that a lot of these children will eventually become criminal in some way. Okay, so moving on, and I would like you to have a look at this because that's predominantly the AO1 side of this. I want you to think about research that supports this, and because we've brought in the term adaptive early on, Lorenz's research of goslings clearly supports this. If you're going to use a piece of research, please ensure that you know exactly why it supports and how it supports. So this clearly suggests that the goslings needed an attachment. It was an innate thing. It was a blueprint. They needed that to survive and to thrive. It helped them survive. They couldn't have survived without it. And it was inbuilt. And the fact that the reason we know that it's inbuilt and innate was that they readily did it and attached to anything that moved. It was something that was so innate that they had no say over who or what they attached with. So in red here, I'm just giving you some idea of how you could evaluate this. It could go against it because, how might this go against it? It could say that, one of the issues is it says that you can attach to anyone or anything, i.e. a Wellington boot. But Bowlby does say it needs to be with the mum. So there is a bit of a difference there. And one of the things about goslings is that they don't discriminate in who or what they attach to, and that, so therefore we could say that this, whilst this research supports, it's a piece of animal research and it actually doesn't tell us a lot about humans because this is really looking at goslings, but we can try to draw out this idea of something innate. Social releases. So is there any research to support this? Have a look at the work of Brazelton. It's in the Green Herd Girl book. And basically it shows cute behaviours in infants elicit caregiving when adults don't respond. The babies are very distressed, suggesting that they use signals to get the caregiver to respond. So it's kind of saying that babies do things on purpose, not in a manipulative way, but it's like an inbuilt kind of way because they know it will get a response. Have a quick look at that research and see if you can have a look at why it and how it supports. We can look at Lorenz and Harlow to support the existence of a critical period. Both of the pieces of research show that both goslings and monkeys do have critical periods. It doesn't matter that they are different critical periods to humans, but the point being that it clearly shows there's a point in time that you have to have formed an attachment by, or something will go wrong. And a good example to kind of back that up from Harlow is the idea that the monkeys who spent the longest away in the cages and isolated became aggressive to their offspring and even started to kill their offspring. So suggesting that they really hadn't formed an attachment during that critical period and they were almost unable to form one, therefore in later life, and they were very damaging to their offspring. Okay, so the next bit, monotropy, Schaefer and Emerson, I did mention earlier we can use that. It goes against it because we do know that babies are able to develop multiple attachments much earlier than Bowlby suggested. Those multiple attachments, according to Schaefer and Emerson, start around 9 months of age. So Schaefer and Emerson's study does kind of say that you can form multiple attachments much quicker. Can I just say that you could use this to support in the sense that it does kind of back up the idea of a monotropous relationship. Internal working model Bailey, if you have a look again in the Green Herd book, this is a piece of research that suggests that an internal working model is actually passed through families. So they interviewed mothers and they interviewed a range of families and found that anyone who had a poor attachment in their childhood were more likely to have poor attachments with their own children. Really easy piece of research, but the point being that it clearly shows that something that's happened early will have some kind of effect later on. Can I just say with that, of course, one of the problems with that is it doesn't show us cause and effect at all. We're mainly we're drawing an inference from something. So what I want you to be very careful of here is it doesn't mean that if you've had quite a poor attachment with your caregiver that you will always have poor attachments in the future. Because remember, it's a theory. Okay, so this is a case study that an application question which is in the Green Herb book. If you could have a go at this, if you don't have access to this, please email me and I will send you the case study to answer that question. There are a couple of these that we will go through when I see you. So, in order to recap and just to demonstrate using some exam questions, number one, please ensure that you can outline Bowlby's theory of attachment. It will want references to the critical period and the internal working model. I would also bring in monotropy. That's why that little mnemonic is useful, because you should access the full 6 marks with that. Briefly evaluate Bowlby's theory of attachment. I've done it through research today, but I will start to show you how you can do it using some of the issues and debates, talking about free will, determinism and so on. I want you to think about, and this is something that you won't really look at until next year, how the research into monotropy could be classed as socially sensitive. Now, I know that you don't know what socially sensitive research is yet, but I want you to think about, so I'll word it like this: what could the effects of doing research like this have on views of mothers? So how, if you like, we're bringing this up to think about it in like an ethical way. How might this, if you like, be damaging to mothers? Okay, so what I would like you to do is, there should be attached on the shared area. Sorry, not the well, yeah, it will be on the shared area when I get into school. But on the Teams files resources area, read each study and discuss how they support or challenge Bowlby's attachment theory. These are some examples of theories. Can I just say that Harlow you have to look at anyway, Schaefer and Emerson you have to look at anyway, Rutter you will be looking at, and Tronick you will be looking at as well. So you don't necessarily have to look at these two, but just have a quick look at some of this research. What you need is research to support or challenge it. You don't always need everything to be positive or negative, and it doesn't have to be balanced. So, as always, think about, and in particular, I've put at the end here a question that you don't know the answer to. So if there's anything today that hasn't been clear from this video, please can you message me on chat or whatever with a question that you do not know the answer to with regards to this. And that'll be a bit of a starting point for me on Thursday, please. If there's anything in this video you don't get, please email me and I'll upload the next lesson tomorrow. Thank you for